The Britain's Got Talent studio carried its familiar Thursday afternoon energy, as Simon Cowell settled into his judge's chair for what he anticipated would be another routine day of auditions. It was a humid September afternoon in 2024, and the iconic red curtains framed the stage where countless dreams had been both realized and shattered over the years. Simon adjusted his signature black t-shirt and took a sip of his tea, mentally preparing himself for the parade of hopeful performers that awaited. At 64 years old, Simon had cultivated his intimidating image with calculated precision. His sharp features, penetrating stare, and reputation for crushing critiques had become his trademark, a carefully constructed persona that commanded fear and respect throughout the entertainment industry. He had never considered how that same intimidating presence might appear to someone who had learned to associate those exact physical and behavioral traits with danger, violence, and family trauma. 4-year-old Amelia Thompson from Glasgow was not scheduled to perform. She had come to watch the taping with her grandmother, Margaret Thompson, who had recently gained custody of the little girl after a harrowing period in which Amelia's father had subjected the family to escalating domestic violence. Amelia was a small, fragile child with light brown hair and wide green eyes that carried the hypervigilant attention of someone who had learned to read adult faces for signs of impending anger and violence. What made Amelia's presence particularly charged was her recent trauma history. Her father, David Thompson, had possessed remarkably similar physical features to Simon, the same dark hair, angular jawline, and intense eyes that could shift from cold indifference to explosive rage without warning. Amelia had spent the first 3 years of her life learning to recognize the subtle facial expressions and body language that preceded her father's violent outbursts, developing survival instincts that made her acutely sensitive to intimidating adult male behavior. The audition process was running smoothly when a teenage dance group took the stage for what should have been an encouraging performance. The 6 young dancers aged 14 to 16 were clearly nervous, and when one of them stumbled during a complex routine, Simon's reaction was characteristically harsh and immediate. "Stop, stop, stop," Simon barked, his voice echoing through the studio with the kind of sudden explosive authority that made everyone in the room flinch. His face transformed from neutral observation to cold anger in seconds, displaying exactly the kind of rapid mood shift that Amelia had learned to fear. The teenagers on stage froze as Simon's intimidating presence filled the studio. His body language, leaning forward aggressively, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed in judgment, was a perfect mirror of the threatening posture that Amelia associated with imminent danger. "That was absolutely embarrassing," Simon continued, his voice carrying the controlled menace that he used to establish dominance. "You've just demonstrated exactly why amateur hour should stay in school gymnasiums and not attempt to masquerade as professional entertainment." Amelia watched from the audience as Simon's face displayed the same expressions of contempt and barely controlled anger that she had seen countless times before. The way he held his mouth, the intensity of his stare, the slight forward lean of his body, everything about his demeanor was triggering memories of her father's behavior during the escalating moments before violence erupted. As Simon prepared to deliver another crushing critique, his facial expression shifted into what Amelia recognized as the dangerous look, the cold, calculating anger that her father had worn before his worst episodes. The resemblance was so exact that Amelia felt her small body go into the freeze response that had often been her only protection. But instead of remaining silent and still as she had been trained to do, something inside Amelia compelled her to speak. Perhaps it was the safety of being with her grandmother, or perhaps it was the confusion of seeing her trauma recreated on what was supposed to be entertainment, but she suddenly stood up in her seat. "That's my mean daddy," Amelia said in a voice loud enough to carry through the studio, her words cutting through Simon's critique like a knife through fabric. The studio fell into stunned silence as every head turned toward the small girl. Simon stopped mid-sentence, his attention drawn to the child who had somehow identified him using language that suggested intimate familiarity with his type of behavior. "What did you say, sweetheart?" one of the other judges asked gently. But Amelia's eyes were fixed on Simon with the kind of fearful recognition that sent chills through everyone who noticed it. Amelia pointed directly at Simon and repeated her observation with the devastating clarity that only traumatized children possess. "You look just like my mean daddy." Simon felt as though he had been struck by lightning. This 4-year-old had just compared him to someone she described as mean daddy, language that suggested not just unkindness but potentially abuse or violence. The way she said it, with a mixture of fear and recognition, implied that she was seeing something familiar and threatening in his appearance and demeanor. Simon's hands began to tremble slightly as he processed being categorized alongside what was obviously an abusive father figure. The idea that this child saw him as belonging to the same category as someone who had harmed her was devastating. "Amelia," her grandmother called softly, trying to guide her granddaughter back to her seat, but Amelia continued to stare at Simon with the fixed attention of someone processing a traumatic trigger. "He has the same angry face," Amelia continued, her small voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to read dangerous adult expressions for survival. "And he talks mean to people the same way Daddy talked mean to Mommy before he hurt her." Simon felt his composure beginning to crumble as this child essentially told him that his behavior reminded her of domestic violence. The comparison between his professional intimidation tactics and abusive behavior was horrifying. The audience watched in growing discomfort as they realized they were witnessing a traumatized child having a recognition response to what she perceived as threatening adult behavior. "Amelia, that's not your daddy," Margaret said gently, moving toward her granddaughter. "That's a man on television who judges singers and dancers." But Amelia shook her head with the certainty of someone who had learned to trust her instincts about dangerous adults. "But he looks scary the same way, and he makes people scared the same way Daddy made us scared." Simon felt something cold and horrible settle in his stomach as this 4-year-old essentially told him that his carefully cultivated, intimidating presence was indistinguishable from that of a domestic abuser. His trembling intensified as he realized that what he considered professional authority, this child experienced as threatening adult male aggression. "Mr. Simon," Amelia said, looking directly at him with those wide green eyes, "are you going to hurt those kids like my daddy hurt us?" The question hit Simon like a physical blow. This child was asking him if he intended to escalate from verbal intimidation to physical violence, suggesting that in her experience, men who looked and acted like him eventually became physically dangerous. Simon's shaking became more pronounced as he struggled to process being seen as a potential perpetrator of violence by someone whose young life had been shaped by male aggression. The idea that his behavior triggered genuine fear responses in vulnerable people was overwhelming. "No, sweetheart," Simon managed to say, his voice barely steady. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I judge performances." But Amelia's response revealed that she had learned not to trust reassurances from intimidating men. "That's what Daddy used to say too, before he got really angry and made Mommy cry." Simon felt his emotional defenses completely collapse as this 4-year-old essentially told him that his denials sounded exactly like those of an abuser. The parallel she was drawing between his behavior and her father's domestic violence was devastating in its accuracy about the psychological impact of intimidation. Standing up from his chair, Simon walked toward the edge of the stage, no longer able to maintain his position as the threatening authority figure. His entire body was shaking now as he processed being seen through the eyes of someone who had learned to recognize dangerous adult behavior as a survival mechanism. "I'm sorry," Simon said, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Amelia, to the performers on stage, or to everyone who had ever felt threatened by his presence. "I'm so sorry." Amelia watched as Simon's intimidating posture crumbled into something that looked like shame and regret. "Are you sorry because you know being scary is wrong?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Simon looked at this remarkable child who had somehow forced him to see his professional persona through the lens of domestic violence and trauma, and felt completely overwhelmed by the moral implications of what she was telling him. "Yes," Simon admitted, tears beginning to form. "I think I am sorry because being scary is wrong." The remainder of that day's auditions became an exercise in Simon attempting to provide feedback without displaying the intimidating behavior that Amelia had recognized as threatening. His critiques became gentler, his posture less aggressive, his entire presence softer as he tried to become someone who wouldn't trigger a traumatized child's survival instincts. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, it became one of the most emotionally impactful segments in the show's history. Amelia's innocent comparison of Simon to her abusive father, and Simon's visible shaking response, sparked international conversations about the difference between professional authority and intimidating behavior, the impact of aggressive criticism on vulnerable people, and the responsibility of public figures to consider how their demeanor affects those who have experienced trauma. More importantly for Simon personally, the encounter with Amelia became a catalyst for fundamentally reconsidering how his intimidating presence affected others, particularly those who had learned to associate his type of behavior with danger. "Amelia didn't just compare me to her abusive father," Simon would later say in interviews. "She forced me to confront the fact that my intimidating behavior was indistinguishable from that of someone who had caused real harm to a family. That 4-year-old made me realize that what I considered professional authority, trauma survivors experienced as threatening aggression. The conversation led Simon to work with trauma specialists and domestic violence counselors to understand how intimidating behavior affects survivors of abuse and to develop approaches to leadership that didn't rely on fear or intimidation. 6 months later, Simon invited Amelia and her grandmother back to the show. Amelia was curious to see if Simon still looked like her mean daddy. "Do you still look scary like my daddy?" Amelia asked with the same directness that had characterized their first meeting. Simon knelt down to her eye level, his entire demeanor softer and more gentle than it had been in years. "I'm trying very hard not to look scary anymore, Amelia. You taught me that looking like someone who hurts people is never okay, even if you're just trying to do your job." Amelia studied his face carefully before offering a tentative smile. "You look nicer now, more like the good grown-ups who help instead of the scary ones who hurt." The story became a landmark moment in discussions about trauma-informed public behavior, the responsibility of media figures to consider how their presence affects vulnerable populations, and the power of childhood trauma recognition in identifying problematic adult behavior. But perhaps most importantly, the conversation demonstrated that sometimes the most important insights about our impact on others come from those who have learned to recognize threatening behavior as a survival skill. In this case, a 4-year-old girl whose experience with domestic violence had taught her to identify dangerous adult patterns, and who had the courage to speak up when she recognized those same patterns being displayed as entertainment.